Hello. Let us continue with developmental disorders. So, is it a delay or is it a disorder? We've talked about this quite a few times. In fact, we don't really need to talk about it a whole heck of a lot again, but just to recap, a delay is when the typical progression of speech is protracted a bit. So wed instead of red is not a disorder, and it might not be a delay. Let me show you what this chart is showing. So we can see that w, the sound for w, comes really early. What you're looking at here is the left side of any of these bars is where 50% of children master the speech sound, and the right side is where 90% of children master the speech sound. If you're after the right-hand side, then it's a lot of times considered a delay. But what's kind of a bummer about that is early intervention is important. Remember from one of our first lectures, early intervention is key. Early intervention means that we're like here. We're intervening when we know that this person is behind maybe 70% of children. Well, the problem is that if they don't qualify for speech therapy because it's not yet a delay. They might be on track to be one of these 90% of kids who don't get W until they're almost 4 years old. But then that means that we can't do early intervention. So it's kind of a, two sides of the coin. We don't want to just spend a bunch of money giving people interventions for things they're going to get. It could possibly help them get it a little bit earlier, but maybe not. But at the same time, we do want to intervene early because that enhances their ability to have normal speech later. The earlier we can intervene, the more normal their speech will be later in time. So, anyway, left side of the bar, 50% mastery. Right side of the bar, 90% mastery. So you can see that W, 50% of kids have W by the time they're a year old, between 1 and 2 years. Pretty cool. Now, if you look down, where is R? Is R not on here? What a piece of crap. Well, we can look at ER and L. So ER, and L is ul. L is considered a liquid sound, and so is R. And you probably know that in some languages there's no distinction between L and R, ul and and you can feel how pretty close they are. In those languages that have no distinction between L and R, the actual sound is a little bit between the two, so it's not a ul or a it's a maybe kind of a little slap against the top of the mouth. And that's the reason why there's no distinction between the two. So we can look at the and the ul and infer that around there is when children are developing their just regular R sound. So it is 50% around 4 years, and for the L, 90% have it by 6, and for 90% have it by 8. So you can see that a lot of people might be walking around saying wed instead of red until they're 4 or all the way up to 8 years old. And that's not considered a delay. That's just typical speech development. So again, not a delay. It's a delay if they continue doing that after about 8 years of age. Then it's considered a delay. So if you have somebody that's 42 and they're saying wed instead of red, that's you know what? That might actually be a disorder. It's a delay if it's taking a little bit longer than usual. A disorder is a persistent delay. I would say 42 is probably a persistent delay. My lisp is probably a persistent delay. That's actually probably not a typical. It's not a delay, actually. It is just a disorder. Sorry, not to confuse. Like I said, fronting is a lot more common than backing. You can see that in this chart as well. A lot of these sounds that kids get first are front sounds. And we know that that makes sense from the McGurk effect, right? So p, m, h is a little weird. That's a back sound. It's not something that people... It's not a front sound. I mean, they get it early, but it's not a front sound. W, n, b, k. K is also not really a front sound. But a lot of these first ones are front sounds. Then you get some more back sounds in here. And then you end up with some of the weird stuff that's just hard for kids to produce. So you've got ch and sh, j, zh, and th, like that. And those are kind of weird because you're producing them differently, right? They're more like creating a noisy signal instead of just temporarily interrupting the speech stream. So it's a little bit different than your typical sounds. And you can see that at the very bottom here, we've got th as in that. 50% of children don't even have that until about 6 years old, and 90% don't get it until 8 years. So that's usually the last one that's going to develop, that and zh. So this is a very handy chart. It'll also be on the exam, so you should look at this chart, know what each side of the line means. Okay, so a delay, we've talked about a delay. Is it a disorder? Well, backing instead of fronting, that's a red flag that there could be a disorder. A persistent delay is also a disorder. Remember, 42-year-old person saying wed instead of red, probably a disorder. Backing, okay. And then any other speech difference that isn't part of the typical trajectory at any age would be considered a disorder. Okay, so familiar versus unfamiliar listener is a really important determination of how intelligible a child is. Speech should be intelligible to strangers by about age 3, and if it's not, then that is another red flag that there may be some sort of disorder. Why is it to unfamiliar listeners? Well, because familiar listeners will start to pick up on the strangenesses, the patterns of the strangeness of the sounds that children are producing. They'll know that some weird sound that no one else would ever know is actually a j, and so they know that when they're saying peanut butter welly or something like that, is peanut butter jelly, right? We can demonstrate this in a way weirder way. Okay, so listen to this sentence. What do you think that said? Does anybody hear anything in that? I mean, it's speech. I can tell you it's speech. What do you think it said? What could that be? Okay, I hear, and of course I've done this a little bit more often. I think it says, she cut with a knife. Okay, now listen to it again. She cut with a knife. Do you hear it now? Now you can't not hear it, right? And now, if you actually listen to the original recording, which is in a British accent.
She cut with her knife. She cut with her knife.
Now you can definitely hear what this is saying.
She cut with her knife.
Right? Totally weird. Okay, let's do another one. Let's do this bottom one here. Okay, what do you think it is? I'll give you a couple seconds to think about it. I hear the man's painting a sign. Let's see if that's right.
The man's painting a sign.
Yay! Wait, sign or sun?
The man's painting a sign.
Yeah, sign. Okay, great. Let's listen to it one more time, then we'll go back to the sine wave speech.
The man's painting a sign.
And you can almost hear the accent in it now too, right? Pretty crazy. So that's sine wave speech. So what's going on before you know what is actually being said? You're an unfamiliar listener. There's no way that that's intelligible to you. But then once you've heard the original, now you're a familiar listener. And this is exactly what's going on with children and their family. This is why we can't really rely on the family to tell us how intelligible the speech is. They know what these weird sounds are that the kids are saying. So that's why it has to be an unfamiliar listener. That's one element that's encompassed in accuracy. How accurate is the speech? Well, can an unfamiliar listener actually figure out what's being said? And they should be able to by age 3. Other things that we use in determining accuracy is the number of sounds produced accurately. Is it just R that's produced inaccurately? Well, if it's just R, if they're saying wed instead of red and that's it, it's not too severe. Even if they're like 42, that's not a really severe disorder. It's just a little thing, right? So we can look at severity that way. But what if they're saying, so we have rabbit, maybe they're saying wabbit. That's just one type of sound that's not being produced accurately. Over here, it's wabbe. And over here, it's aye. So we can see that the severe disorder, they're not producing any of their consonant sounds at all. They're not even producing them incorrectly. They're just not producing them. I think one of my favorite ones on here is refrigerator. So refrigerator, a mild disorder would be wifwida. Really, they're just having trouble with the R. And they're putting in a D instead of a J sound. But again, J is one of the later ones, so that's to be expected. A moderate disorder is fwidawaya, and the severe is just we. So you can hear how severe some of these actually can be. Another thing we look at is accuracy in different positions. So fork versus knife is very strange. You're accurate with fork. You can say the f in fork, but then you say knife. You put a P in instead of knife. This is actually good. It's kind of weird, but it's actually good. It shows that they can produce the fork, the F in fork at the beginning, but maybe in the middle it gets a little bit more difficult. So it shows that they're progressing. They've got it sometimes. They can actually make it. So you can use that. You can use that ability that they can make that sound to help them figure out that it needs to go in knife as well. And then we also look at production of complex things. So can they say, well, string, complex strings, the STR in string is a complex string. So how well can they say complex strings? If they can say string, that's good. If they can even say stwing, that's great. I mean, it shows that there's still a substitution going on, but they're getting that cluster together. So it's not as severe. If they can get the cluster, they're just swapping out that one speech sound. But if they can't get the cluster and they're swapping out that speech sound, it's a much more severe disorder. And then another thing is their ability to use synonyms. That shows, again, word knowledge. Okay, so which is more likely to have an identifiable cause? Is it articulatory disorders or phonological disorders? This is your participation word for the week. Last time, I think I said day. I should have said week. We're going to have one participation thing per week. So this is yours. Which is more likely to have an identifiable cause? I want you to go on and do it now. I'm not giving you points for being right. I want to know what you think. I'll give you a few seconds. Pause the video. Go do it. And now I will give you the spoilers. An articulatory disorder is more likely to have an identifiable cause. A phonological problem is a cognitive issue. Sometimes we can show that people have had strokes, like the guy a couple lectures ago with the chipmunk. I think it was a chipmunk, maybe a squirrel. So he had a stroke. There are sometimes people who have other types of TBI. Maybe a piece of shrapnel has gone into the brain. So we can see that there's actually a cause here. But a lot of times with phonological disorders, especially in kids, we have no idea what's causing the phonological disorder. An articulatory disorder, however, we can see that there's muscular weakness. We can see that maybe there's malformation of the jaw. We can see that maybe there's malformation of some of the muscles. So we can see articulatory problems. Those are usually ones that have an identifiable cause because they're physical in nature, so it makes sense. There's also perceptual problems. So one cause and one risk factor for developing sorry about that. One risk factor for developing developing a disorder sorry, I've been talking too much, is hearing loss. So it could be temporary hearing loss from an ear infection. It also could be permanent hearing loss, just from birth or an injury. We know that the visual is almost as important as the auditory, or they're equally important, I should say. So if you have hearing loss, you're not really getting the full, I hesitate to say picture, you're not getting the full experience of all of these speech sounds. So it's going to slow down people in their speech development. And it could also cause speech problems as well. Not everything is picked up on purely by visual sight. And you can hear that too. Sometimes there's, it'll sound like people who are deaf might have a little bit of a kind of like an accent. And that's because there's things going on. They might be really good at reading lips, but a lot of the stuff that's in the front is really easy to see. A lot of the stuff that's happening back inside is very difficult to see. So that might get left out. We can also have other structural problems like a cleft lip and palate, which we'll talk a lot about soon, but it can cause air to flow differently. I think this guy has a little bit of hypernasality, which could come from a cleft palate. And then we can also have muscular weakness and problems with the motor program. So let's see if we can listen to this speech really quickly.
Although his speech sounds different than in the previous example. That is because there are a number of different types of dysarthria depending on what areas of the brain are involved. This child has hypernasality, or too much air coming out of his nose. He also has a strained quality to his voice, which is very unusual in childhood apraxia, but is often heard in dysarthria. His speech rate is slow, and he has reduced ability to move his lips and tongue. During therapy, he is working hard to learn strategies to compensate for this weakness. Tell me how you play that game?
My play was 4 and 6, 10 people.
4 to 6 people.
Play. On 20 to play the game.
To play the game.
And 6. You're 20.
So there's a lot of air coming out through the nose. You can kind of hear that in the way that he says, I think he's saying 28. But you can kind of hear, you can hear the air coming out of the nose. That's hypernasality. That comes up, like I said, a lot with a problem with the soft palate, well, it could be a problem with the hard palate too, but probably that would have been fixed surgically by now. But there could be a problem elevating the velum. If he has dysarthria, it's a muscular, it relates to issues with muscles, and so it might be that he's not able to raise the velum to prevent air from going into the nasal passages. It's okay if you don't really know what a velum is yet. It's just that part back here, like the uvula is part of the velum. So you can feel it lift up. It's up most of your speech. When you say things like and it's down. You can feel air come through. But anyway, if you have muscular weakness, generalized muscular weakness, it's probable that you're going to have problems elevating the velum. So that's what's going on. This guy has generalized muscular weakness, but again, if you have a cleft palate, like a cleft of the soft palate, you're not able to elevate the velum either, even though you don't have generalized muscular weakness, because a cleft of the soft palate means that the muscles necessary to elevate the velum aren't there. So of course you'd have trouble elevating it if you don't have those muscles. Okay. And that's the end of this lecture. Come back and we'll do the last one, the fourth one in the series.